Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to Instituto. We are here today with Bruno Alves de Almeida, Asli Serbest and Mahall for the session.
Hello everyone and welcome to Instituto. We are here today with Bruno Alves de Almeida.
This is a series dedicated to sharing work in progress, to debating issues and exhibitions that are being done right now. Today we're talking to Bruno about these very interesting guests. Last time in the previous talks, we talked to Bruno about Bruno's own work and also with the Grupo Inteiro practice in Brazil. Last year we did 7 episodes of WIP, 1 online, 1 in person, and 6 online already during the quarantine. And now this year we invited Bruno Alves de Almeida to do 4 more episodes from WIP 8 to WIP 11, and it's been very interesting. It has to do with the transdisciplinary practices that deal with architecture, built environment, and so on. So without further ado, I'll give the words to Bruno. Thanks.
Obrigado, Joanna. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 3rd of 4 sessions. We're halfway there. And every Thursday of April, we have been gathering here to talk with different practitioners, and tonight we'll be in conversation with Asli Serbest and Mona Mahall, who develop projects which evolve into online and offline spaces, installations, objects, publications that play and replay architectural histories, events, and movements with the aim to rethink the production of space and its implied power relations. It's just a little glimpse of their bio. Mona and Asli exhibit and publish internationally. They're also the co-editors of Junkjet, an independent magazine on art, architecture, and media. They co-curated the 7th International Sinop Biennial under the title Politics of Location in 2019, among many other things that they will show us this evening. Before I give the word to Asli and Mona, I would like to tell all of those watching on YouTube that you can leave your comments and questions in the chat, and we will address them later on in our conversation. So without further ado, welcome Mona, welcome Asli. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for being here, and the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you for the invitation. Hello. By the way, I'm Asli and this is Mona. And yes, thank you for the invitation and for the kind introduction, Johanna and Bruno. We are very happy to be here in the place of the internet with you, and simultaneously also at our studio in Berlin all alone. We wish we could be in Porto at the beautiful place of Instituto. As we all share a bit of Zoom fatigue, we try to make this talk as conversational as possible. It can not just happen between us 3 or 4, but hopefully between all of us with a link to YouTube. So please feel invited. I would like to emphasize what Bruno said. Please feel invited to join the discussion whenever you want. Let's start with a few reflections on our practice. So we are starting with a few reflections on our practice I mentioned, while our remote moon here soon is offering something to look at without explaining it in detail. We are interested in the production and reproduction of spaces. Therefore, we use images, drawings, objects, language, and other media Bruno already mentioned. The moon was part of a theater play. When we share some reflections on this practice, it's important to mention that we do not see them as foundational. Our reflections do not provide us a fundament or a sort of ground from which to start. Actually, the opposite is true. The reflections, let's call them speculations, are there to question and unfix our own fixations. We talked with Bruno about the uprootedness of theory in relation to practice. Our reflections or speculations are there to question roots, R-O-O-T-S, roots. Roots are mostly used as a metaphor to claim a certain side of foundational knowledge, of privileged access to truth. We see them as naturalized conventions. So instead of relying too much on reflection as a tool to go back to some roots, we try to think of it as speculation. Speculation implies uncertainty and a possibility to fail. It moreover implies an active, not so much a contemplative mode.
So, and I take over from Asli and also echo Asli when I emphasize that for us, speculation is uprooting. We consider speculation as uprooting in our practice. And also because Bruno asked us for this, I will try to discuss the term speculation a bit further. Therefore, I will share with you some images of our book with the title How Architecture Learned to Speculate. And in this book, we try to understand speculation beyond its easy use for architectural experiments or artistic experiments for radical architecture or utopian projects. We wanted to go beyond this simple use because also we connected it very much to kind of marketing language in relation to architecture. And we tried to figure out how to understand this from a historical point of view, but also from a systemic point of view. So for us, or for our approach to this theory, we started with the prospective character of speculation. That speculation is always directed to the future, that it's oriented towards the future, even if we look back into the history, for example, to the history of architecture, we do this in a sort of prospective or projective way in order to develop something that might be realized or might become true later on. For us, this prospective character that we see with speculation is characteristic to all design processes. Design processes beyond any disciplinary borders. So when we talk about design processes, we also address those processes that we know from art, from design as a discipline, but also, of course, in architecture. So speculation is oriented to the future, and therefore it's strategic. It's a strategic process or a set of operations. Strategy, you might perhaps, you might be familiar with this term, is, let's say, a mode of acting that tries hard to develop a plan, to develop even a master plan. And that's very quickly connected to modern architecture if you just hear the word master plan. So speculation is connected to a plan, but at the same time, and Asli already mentioned this, it's highly uncertain. So you never know if it's going to function or if it's going to work out what you're planning, what you are designing. So this uncertainty was something that we tried to understand through the lens of processes that we know, especially from modern times, that are connected to, let's say, financial markets. Yeah, speculation that we know as dealing with values, dealing with financial values, but not only with financial values, but also with aesthetic, with formal values, with economic values beyond money, with social and political values. So in order to understand speculation within art and architecture, we looked at financial markets and how, here, by the way, you can see mountains that are depicting, fake mountains that are depicting charts. Yeah. So in order to develop this theory about speculation, we tried to figure out how the play and the manipulation of values is functioning. Therefore, we not just went to, let's say, an economic theory of values and the volatility of values. Here you can see the first bourse crash, the panic of tulips in the Netherlands. So we went back to economic theory, but also to art theory, specifically to the Russian art theorist and philosopher Boris Groys, who describes in his book Über das Neue, now I'm missing the English title, he's describing an economy of culture where all processes follow a certain dynamic, and this is specifically true in modern times, in our modernity. So this modernity is dynamic because it deals with values that are not longer fixed, let's say. Values, and I'll just give you one example so that you have a bit more of a flesh feeling with it. Let's say if you think of the formal language of postmodernism that introduced historical elements back into architecture. This is a very speculative turn and a very radical form of speculation, because during modernism, throughout the first half of the 20th century, historical forms like pediments and columns and all these things, they were rigidly fighted against. They were regarded as crime. You might quote Adolf Loos, but throughout postmodern times, so in a post-war period or even later, these elements were consciously reintroduced to also counter values that came along with modernism, which is universalism, that is a sort of functionalism that reduces function to mere pragmatics. So let's say this is a very banal example. You could also mention functionalism itself as a value in architecture. functionalism, as we know it from modernist time, is a point of view towards architecture. It's a position towards architecture. And it's something that you might guide your design. So it could be a guiding principle, but it also forms a standard. But anyways, it's not clear what kind of function are we talking about. The definition of function itself is highly negotiated and discussed. So the value of functionalism has a lot to do with the ups and downs, of certain trends, of certain dynamics that we recognize, especially within modern culture. And that's basically what we try to discuss in this book. And it's a sort of a meta-theoretical approach that becomes very critical when we turn over to the mechanisms. And I'm not talking about financial mechanisms now, because I think in financial fields, they are very necessary. But when we talk about mechanism to control values, to control the movement of values within art and architecture, we have to figure out what are the institutions, what are those in power to control values and to manipulate values. And that's basically, let's say, the second part of this book, where we try to figure out how this power relations have structured not just the practical fields of architecture and art, but also and especially the academic fields. So for us, the question was how to deal with the power structures that are inherent within our fields, that we also inherited from our fields, so that we are all taking part and that we can observe and can understand, but also wanted to counter or even deconstruct. And this value control, or we could also use Foucault's term of truth regimes. This is something that we are occupied with until today. More on practical terms, not so much on this meta-theoretical level, but it's something that is pervading our culture, and that has a lot to do with the hierarchies and patriarchal structures that are still very strong, and that in our practice, while not even only mentioning feminist topics or contents, but also dealing with an ethics and feminist ethics we want to address.
So when we look at the power structures, we recognize the urgent need of a feminist approach. A feminist ethics in the sense of Rosi Braidotti, that teaches us processes of becoming woman, becoming animal, becoming minoritarian, becoming machine, becoming other, and becoming nomad. It's about acknowledging minorities, peripheries, non-professionals, children, animals, or women as important but marginalized voices in the production of space. It is also about challenging the professional and disciplinary structures because they are unequal and exclusive, as Mona mentioned. We have started to develop our lexicon on feminist spatial utopias. It is a lexicon in space with models, fragments, videos. It includes women who we think have contributed with what we call minor utopias, minor in a good way, in contrast to masculine major utopias in the context of Bauhaus modernism. The minor operations oppose a tabula rasa ideology and allow for a spatial connection and situated relations. Locatedness is again important. As one minor operation, we think of subtraction, n-1, as a vitalis, not a negative form. The surgical operations of elimination and amputation, not complete destruction. Thereby, we are inspired by a text by Gilles Deleuze, discussing the subtraction of male authority figures from Shakespeare's plays by Italian director Carmelo Bene. He also cuts off Romeo from Romeo and Juliet. The amputation leaves the characters in completely different relations. Marginal figures become important. Main characters just dissolve.
So perhaps just to add, because we are also extremely excited about this operation by Deleuze, but also into this operation to just delete or eliminate a main character from a theater play, even a main character from theater plays. So it's not just intervening within one piece, but it's also questioning a whole canon. In these terms, it's the canon of the theater field, let's say. But it's something, and that's perhaps because we started with the notion of transdisciplinarity, or perhaps better interdisciplinarity. That's how we try also to connect different fields, be that art and architecture or theater, or different cultural fields, that we try to somehow understand certain speculative strategies, let's say, to also translate them into our own spatial practice, perhaps best say. Sorry, Asli.
Maybe we can go to the next image.
Yeah.
Another entry of Mexico cleaning by 1984. This is our model of the house clean and dry itself. By pressing a button, sprinklers in the ceiling of each room are activated to clean the room with detergent and water, followed by hot air drying. The building construction not only cleans the house, but also clothes, dishes, and even the doghouse. The giant dishwasher, it was called like that, eliminates mainly women's reproductive labor and unpaid housework in completing the Frankfurt kitchen concept.
And it also obviously turns the rationalization and the, let's say, the technological progress that is also part of our domestic spaces into a radical and therefore into a critical project, as it turns the whole processes of progress or of rationalization, of optimization against itself, obviously it's and there has been a prototype, and the woman was always standing in the rain basically because her house was cleaning, and so it's also about questioning our basic presumptions that have been addressed through Bauhaus modernism, as we described at the beginning, but that is also part of our ongoing technological lives, let's say.
Maybe we go to the next one. So Dauerwelle also belongs to the lexicon. It is a 60s passenger ship that we turn into an agile traveling art space, moving on inland waterways between different localities in urban or rural places, in dense or in more scattered areas. It's not so much an art container that can be visited, but rather itself an act of visiting. We found it on eBay, by the way. You can see here in the next image. Yes, here our spatial design for the ship. Spatial, not special. Spatial design for the ship. We are just adapting it, not transforming it into something else. Basically, we take out the middle deck and install some walls without closing it up completely.
Perhaps just one sentence, because it's on my mind still, to reconnect it to the subtraction part. We take out the middle deck, the ceiling, let's say, and thereby we're, as this Italian director did with Shakespeare's Romeo, he just imagine this, he just eliminated Romeo from Romeo and Juliet, and thereby he could switch and manipulate all other relationships on the stage. So suddenly very marginal characters became very important, yeah, and this is also something we really are curious to see with our boat, how like this spatial intervention could change the relationships that we are used to on the boat. You have to imagine the boat is quite low and sits very deep within the water. So now you have, when you're just moving around the space, you always have the water line, the surface of the water, almost here at your height here, like almost at your shoulders, depending on your size, obviously. So this means that you are walking almost underwater now, and these kind of relationships are something that we are interested in, how to deal and how to transform the relationships. And here it's very much about not sitting above the water, but being in the water almost. Okay, sorry, Asli, that I always interrupt you.
That's good. Also, maybe I would like to add on the right upper part, not only the ship, also we found some old letters and postcards containing the ship. So these are the postcards also from eBay. So instead of designing a new gallery in the city center of Bremen as commissioned by Hochschule für Künste, we came up with the idea of a traveling art space. Bremen is actually a city connected to the network of European waterways and also to the ocean. As a floating traveling space without solid ground, the ship wants to operate beyond borders. Not just national borders, but also between city and periphery, different audiences and locations. It wants to enable different public spheres and facilitate encounters as a political and aesthetic impulse. It understands location as the place of experience, connections, and intersections through roots rather than roots.
We really did this on the screen that it's clear what we mean, because it's difficult to understand, obviously.
And pronounce it.
Yes.
So to come back to the lexicon.
After some images. No.
Okay, after some images now. As you can see, with the absurd parts of it, like the Annie Albers Museum in Bottrop, here on a satellite view, we are also trying to challenge the format of lexicon itself. We subvert the institution, that's the lexicon, by including fictional projects or provocations. Like a museum for Annie next to the one for her husband, Joseph.
That is actually existing in Bottrop. Perhaps you haven't been there. We haven't been there, to be honest, but we know that there is this very modernist, rectangular square museum, and it's just for Joseph Albers. Yeah, even though we all know that Annie Albers played a crucial role, again, in Bauhaus, in the Bauhaus environment, but has not been regarded part of this community in the history of architecture or art.
And it's here where feminism starts to work, to challenge and to change formats and dispositives. And in this case, it aims at subverting a lexicon or a canon as a fixed collection of examples. Strategically speaking, we try in all of our projects to work as feminists, trying to go for the process, not for the product, countering hierarchies also in our own environment in favor of more collective frameworks.
So even though we are identifying as women, let's say as female, it's not that we share an essentialist view on feminism. It's rather that we really want to develop an ethics out of what we could learn and have learned from feminism for the last 100 or 120 years. And it's obviously an open process. So it's something, and that's also very interesting. Feminism is like the sharpest critique of its own. So when you look into feminist theory and the harsh critique that is addressed towards feminism, it's always coming from within feminism, and at least we think that's super interesting to pay attention to. Okay, but we have another project, and Bruno already mentioned it. It's the Sinop Biennial at the Turkish Black Sea coast that we curated in 2019 under the title of A Politics of Location. So it was the 7th edition, and obviously you can see that it's a quite remote, even here, a quite remote small city in Turkey. And the title of A Politics of Location was, on the one hand, addressing this remoteness and the fact that we still keep on differentiating between center and periphery. a sort of dialectics that we wanted to challenge, obviously, but also we somehow were inspired by a poem and some texts from feminist poet Adrienne Rich, who framed the notion of a politics of location as something that helps us reconnect thinking, theory, and speaking, obviously, with a situated experience, with a particular location, with a particular place, a particular geography, and even a particular body. So to just come back for a moment to feminist theory, it's poets or it's thinkers like Adrienne Rich who actually challenged the universalism of the first wave feminism, or even the second wave feminism, stating that feminism is not the same for all women on the planet, that all women have their problems and have their fights, but that they are different depending on race, depending on class, and of course, depending on their cultures. So a politics of location is something that is very much trying to connect to a certain site, to a certain place, at a certain moment in time, and for a certain period of duration, let's say, at least when we talk about the biennial, because we tried very much to turn this exhibition into a process-based series of events. When we talk about location, and that's again why we put our funny GIF here, we are not talking about a site as something that is bounded up and closed down, not as something where we can gain foundational knowledge, yeah? But rather as a site that is constituted by the intersections, by the conflicts, by connections, events, by displacements, by travels, we could say, and that is constituted to these relations more than to some sort of mythical rootedness. So we invited artists, perhaps we can go on to the next image. We invited artists to take part in this situated or located biennial, and we asked them not to bring their precious artworks and land them there to be admired by the public or not. But we really invented them to spend some time there and start developing processes or projects even with members of the community there, with citizens, with different people, even also refugees that were relatively isolated at that moment in this region. And I mean, I said we invited artists. That's not the whole story, because we also invited, again, an interdisciplinary approach. We invited architects and we invited students who took over a very important role in developing workshops, in preparing their own movements throughout this region of the coast. And we try to reflect on and discuss our experiences throughout the evenings. especially also with the public, as we wanted to share responsibilities and agencies. So all the fragments and the documents that were part of the processes there were exhibited at the end of the biennial. So the biennial started during the late spring and ended with a September exhibition. And this was the main venue. It's called Hall. It is a former marketplace. So it used to be where Sinopians went for shopping. But as there are new and obviously more modern malls, this place was somehow a bit lost or perhaps even left behind. For us, it seemed to be the best thing we could find there. Because it was still inhabited by some of the Sinopians. There were some offices, and here is a floor plan. There were some offices, there is a greengrocer, there is a tea shop where the elder persons meet. So it was basically a very everyday life environment, and we could just use empty shops there and empty spaces, and obviously also the inner courtyard. Yes, and it was a very special place. It was so important for this project that we even think of it as, let's say, a typological model and a spatial model for future exhibitions. It's never going to be a white cube, but it's something that might provide inclusion and openness to all possible persons, just because they can pass by without perhaps without even knowing what's happening there, and immediately feeling right at a certain place, because there are so many things to do beyond art and beyond elitist discourses, that it feels very open and very inclusive in the best sense of the word. So this was my vision of the space. Here you can see images. We just switched through some projects. We had a wooden donkey that would join us for walks into the city. It was actually like an instrument, an audio instrument, where you could talk to others through pipes and be very echoing. It was very nice and very playful. There were wooden plates installed throughout the city with birds that cross Sinop during their movements into the winter habitats. There was a light installation in a bit of a competition with the touristic boats. And there was the final exhibition taking place here at the second venue, which is a former ice factory, also not in use any longer. So we moved in without doing a lot of things. Again, we just used this space as found, and we're lucky that there is a new roof providing protection from the rain. So this was the exhibition hall for our final goodbye, let's say, for our final goodbye that was actually not a conclusion, but just a point of continuation. because all the processes and all the fragments and documents from the processes just stopped for a moment to be continued right after it. So in one last image, as I said, the roof had been reconstructed, but before it just had this water issue. And we thought it's a nice texture on this wall that we wanted to keep. Also, again, working against the notion of a white cube and the neutrality of the exhibition space. We know that exhibitions are not neutral collections or neutral setups of art pieces or other things, of objects. They are organizing how we gather, how things gather and how we gather with these things. They regulate our perception. They stratify the access. They give us the frame through which we actually only start looking at something as something. So they are highly political environments that are, again, and I'm referring back to the topic of institutions when it comes to processes of speculations. They are powerful devices, and without claiming that we can solve this device that is an exhibition, we always try to evolve them as politically transformative. And that's the key word for the next exhibition.
So they are never representations of projects, but projects themselves. The exhibition at Pinakothek der Moderne in Munich was showing temporary forms of a city that is instant, ephemeral, and precarious urban phenomena like refugee camps, festivals, military bases, and informal markets. Spaces that transgress the physical and social borders of continuous cities. The show investigated the processes that relate, question, and even collapse these spaces to and with each other. Because these spaces are related in that they are temporary but also unequal neighbors of our globalized world. Here I'm going through some images from the exhibition. And here is a time market clocked by a train.
So again, there were a lot of different media in this exhibition, like this video, but also plans and analytical drawings, objects, different sound recordings that we also made. Of course, this is one spectacular example where they are like folding the roofs. In the second, the train has just passed by. And obviously you can see that it's already touristified to a large degree.
Also interesting from the point of view of tourism, but also photography, because as we see, people are confused to photograph the market or the train. So they want to photograph both at the same time, but the camera has to be directed on both directions. So I'm jumping to the next one through a spatial image. Chuquicamata in Chile is part of an extraction site that produced this small city and will also end it, actually. The huge environmental impact will always stay. Our spatial intervention for this exhibition took the form of a labyrinth, interconnecting the different spaces and dissolving the separation between inside and outside. From Bataille, we know, from Georges Bataille, we know that there is no getting around the labyrinth. He says, we are citing him, distance like proximity, separation like adhesion remain undecidable there. In this sense, one is never either inside or outside the labyrinth. A space, perhaps that's already too much to say, a space that would be constituted by none other than this very anxiety, which is, however, incurably undecidable. Am I inside or am I outside?
Very much connecting back to the question of global relationships. So what we treat as outside are not part of our own exclusive world. In contrast to the connections we might find if we look closer, and the relations that we wanted to establish through this very, very close spatial intervention is something that was, let's say, the main idea in this project for the Pinakothek.
And here we see a warm perspective onto the whole exhibition architecture with the sequence of caverns, not only a labyrinth. And at the end of the exhibition, we are going through the exhibition quickly. Yes, at the end of the exhibition space, we provided an open space to come together for collective events and discussions on these very horizontal printed carpets. So I think we would like to stop with the carpets and we can discuss.
Because they turned out to be the most important place, obviously, because people were gathering and sitting down and sharing their own experiences and discussing things. So perhaps you can do this as well.
Thank you so much for the amazing presentation. Wow, I'm surrounded by my notes here. And I said I wouldn't, that I would make a big deal out of the moon that you presented in the first slide. And I don't know if we need to start, maybe it's better for the online stream to stop sharing, unless you want to have us.
No, perfect.
But I'm still thinking about the moon and about the tone it's set, because it's such a familiar, it's our familiar satellite, is our buddy, you know, it's our planetary buddy, but at the same time, there's always that dark face that we don't see. And I really like the way you started it, saying that your projects do not try to prove a hypothesis or necessarily prescribe a certain methodology or solution, but to maybe offer other self-reflective modes of thought. And maybe a point to start following, you know, the course of your presentation is to go back to this notion of the speculative. And while I was reading your book, and I think you explained very well some of the concepts that I wanted to go deeper in, the interrelation between this idea of content and value vis-a-vis this idea of strategy. And I also think there's so much to unpack there, but in regards to what the speculative dimension of architecture could be. But what I wanted to think together with you, or get a bit of what your feelings are, is in relation to, you know, the possibility of a creation of a theory of architecture in regards to strategy and not content, and this an uprooting character that's the speculative process has. How does that, what other dimensions does that acquire in the situation that we're living today, or in such a global, or in situations of a global mobilization under like a shared condition that has completely uprooted us from our normality, but also from the way we perceive space, the way we perceive inside and outside, and the way we perceive global relations. I mean, it's from the individual scale of the body and of the interconnectedness that, for example, we're now having here, you know, even though we're sharing a white background and our black outfits, but it's also about this macro scale of, you know, the global behavior, the global dynamics. And I was just wondering if throughout this, this new mode of experiencing space and experiencing togetherness and so on and so forth, if somehow your approach in this interrelation between the speculation, content, and strategy shifted, perhaps if this situation is allowing more or less for a possibility of the speculative within architectural practice or within spatial practice in general. I don't know, I just wanted to get a bit of your update through the situation of what the speculative could mean.
I mean, we observed the speculative as a crucial or a characteristic dynamic of modernity. Yeah, that's how we started. There is something underlying all questions of what is right or what is wrong. So it's, let's say, it could also be described as an infrastructural theory, you know, trying to look behind and figure out some certain logics of how our culture is basically still modern, we could say. And I think, perhaps Asli can correct me, I think that it's very much connected to our media spaces. It is very much also founded on media and the medial in architecture, which started basically perhaps most prominently with Palladio distributing his designs through a conventional set of drawings, let's say, yeah, through not that the drawings were conventional, but he developed conventions to draw architecture, and he published them. So I think it's part of understanding architecture, not just from, and that's what we mean with content, from inside our images, our drawings, and even our products, but rather also to understand what makes us do these things and what is controlling, what are the hidden protocols, let's say, that very much regulate how we are dealing with architecture, but also even with art, I guess. Yeah, and therefore, its speculation for us was always a meta theory. So we always try to understand what is happening from a point of view of a very distanced outsider, even. Yeah, trying to understand what has happened with architecture throughout modern times, when suddenly values like the classical canon, yeah, became disputed, when suddenly values entered like environmentalism, Yeah, and they are crucial. I think these discussion around values, they very much inform and also serve as a tool for emancipation of our discipline. That is definitely necessary. At the same time, these values, as we can see also within other fields of our lives, are to a certain degree very much under control of structures that are very persistent. Yeah, and that's why we think a feminist approach is very urgent, as a tool, not as a content again. Yeah. So, could I answer a bit of your question?
Yes.
I would like to just emphasize or also add that because you were also mentioning actuality and currently how we maybe also continue thinking of it, but especially thinking of the media, and it, in terms of speculation, it has a lot to do that values only can become mobile through media, and in terms of how medialized we became and we are, I think it is in a way an accelerated version of speculation on any ways. So I believe, and also Mona, you can correct, that it is a kind of condensed and accelerated version, because through the more medialized we are, the more mobile the values get, and speculation on an every level becomes crucial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think later on, I think I want to ask some questions that might then pick up with this, with these notions again. But I was also thinking about these ideas of site specificity, and we in the previous session we discussed these notions of body specific, person specific, and knowledge specific with o grupo inteiro, our previous guests. And I find it beautiful, your idea or your reference to Adrian's Rich with this politics of location, and this approach to site that is not about rootedness. Indeed, it's about the connections, intersections, encounters, and conflicts, and so on and so forth. And I was curious to know what you think about the idea of site specificity on the one hand, and on the other hand, if you could elaborate a little bit more how these ideas of nomadic spaces, placeless places, itineraries that we see are transversal in many of your projects, and it goes back to that sentence of roots and not roots that is so hard to pronounce in a clear way. So if you could elaborate a little bit more how these more fluid and itinerant processes actually allow you to understand and explore the site, and bring the criticality of your projects that bring to the exploration of these places.
Let's say if we discuss the site through the lens of the biennial, it was, or it is for us, very much connected to not entering somewhere, yeah, and being certain about infrastructure, about a continuous or perhaps even a homogeneous public. Not being certain, and that's perhaps the speculative part also, not being certain how things will work out, failure is something that is, I think, very much connected to the notion of sight. Yeah, because it can only be a failure entering a site from outside. Asli is Turkish, yes, but at the same time, we have been living we have only been living in Germany. I mean, Asli has studied in Istanbul, which is completely different, obviously, from the small northern Turkish town. So obviously you enter something, and the only thing that is possible is actually to just miss it, yeah, to just misunderstand it, but to turn this misunderstanding into something productive. And that's what we tried with the processes that we started there, and we failed. We failed completely. At one point during, it was almost like all the processes were over, but at one point we invited a Greek artist whose family actually used to live there, but who had to flee when there was the so-called exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey. And she describes her, she's based in Germany, and she describes this uprootedness again, yeah, in her films, and we invited her. And it was impossible in this context to show this film that she did, because it was immediately taken as sort of an accusation against Turkish, the Turkish state offending and killing Greek population. And so they basically censored us, so we couldn't show this film, and we just stopped with our program. We just left, yeah, we just left the site and moved on to a place in Istanbul where we tried to discuss what has happened there. So so this is what we actually meant with not being rooted somewhere, but trying to investigate and explore the roots that somehow traverse these places more than anything else. We think that it's about these relationships and the conflicts and also the connections, obviously, that constitute a site, which is obviously never seen, or we don't see in any ways essential, yeah, as something that is there and is fixed to a certain tradition or inhabited by a same population or so. The site for us is something in process, as something that is also transformed immediately when entered. And therefore also we try to think of institutions, especially art institutions, as something that is not based at a safe place with a fixed public, yeah, with an audience that you know from a certain moment onwards. With a characteristic program, but rather as an alien also, and that's why we really worked hard for the ship and to make this happen. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned in your presentation when you were talking about Sinop and these exhibition spaces that are not your typical white cube. And also your attempt to create these threads of shared responsibilities and agencies. And I was wondering, when you have to deal with art institutions, for example, or even with these kind of fixed temporalities of events such as biennials, there seems to be a clash of temporalities there, no? You know, the temporality that your project and I'm not talking about the exhibition ship or boat. I think that might be an alternative to what I'm saying, and I wanted to hear your thoughts about it. But the temporality that many of your projects require seem to go on the contrary hand of the temporalities that institutions predefine. So I wanted to hear how also you adapt your projects, or to what extent your projects also voluntarily create that friction and that questioning both of the institutional given temporalities and probably their assumption also of a homogeneous public.
Do you want to answer?
I think this on both of the projects, as you mentioned, we can answer this with the filter of the Sinop Biennial, but also with the ship. And let me start with some thoughts about the ship. The main idea is to think of a traveling exhibition space is also to challenge the institutions, because in a way institutions would not even call themselves that they get rooted in a space. So it somehow I would say even tries to cut these roots from one place and go to not to the center, but also to the periphery, and also challenge this notion of center and periphery, which is being even happening now with the crisis and with the big cities and with a huge desire to the countryside. But what it means for showing art, showing works, and what it means for the institutional space when it loses its roots, and also in terms of what you meant, or what you asked, the homogeneous audience. So with the ship, I think there is only a possible heterogeneous audience, including the captain itself or herself.
I mean, for me, your question is really somehow addressing the main issue with our work. Yeah, it's really like putting the finger into the wound or whatever, because actually it's our problem how to fit into a framework of an institution, how to show things. Oftentimes we are wondering, okay, but what is it that we are basically sharing with the others? How can we visualize, formalize? How can this become something that is transportable? Yeah, and that's one of our biggest issues. Yeah, and we are oftentimes in conflicts about how to do this. Yeah, how this could be done. Once we had an exhibition in Istanbul, and we wanted to invite DJs, because we set up a dance floor, and we wanted to invite DJs so that the audience, the visitors of the exhibition, could just stop by and perhaps also start dancing, simply because it was part of our process. Yeah, dancing was the main topic of our work. But how could we represent dancing, or talk about dancing, or show dancing? If you're not dancing, it's not there also. But obviously the institution was not super happy, because they had opening hours, They didn't want to just produce chaotic conditions. There were other pieces that were perhaps to be protected, and all these things, yeah, were huge, like practical, but also conceptual issues, yeah. And so it's a continuous struggle. That's for me, I don't have an answer to your question other than we are struggling with it, you know, and we are often failing with it also, I guess. Yeah.
But I think it's the work. The struggle is the work because it's because it's a process-based work, and it's about the process of the struggle.
Yeah,
and it's also to do with this indisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity, this struggle, somehow not only combining the disciplines, but even questioning even the borders of disciplines. So it's again, like always, this question that is or many times that is asked. So if it's art or architecture, even the institutional spaces of art and architecture, I think it's again a struggle to find a place in general. And it has, you mentioned it with your question, it is a nomadic space, also a nomadic space in terms of nomadic thinking, and nomadic, like in terms of disciplines, not being again not rooted in one main discipline and becoming a nomad between the disciplines.
Yeah, I think the struggle is also a part of it's also somehow an operation of the project, an operation of the work. So I think it's generative to a certain extent. And I was wondering also this idea of nomadism in between how you self-perceive your role, or how the institution or whoever perceives your agency within that constellation of forces, how that can be leveraged. So for example, how is what's the difference in the access that you have to certain decisions or decision-making power, if you are labeled as the curator, or if you're labeled as the spatial practitioner, or if you're there in a position of the architect that is invited, or someone that is responsible for contributing to the exhibition and not curating it or organizing it. And I was wondering about this notion of the curatorial that I mentioned in my presentation in the beginning, rather than curating per se. So let me just get my quote, because it's something that I read from Maria Lind in Art Forum, and she talks about the curatorial as a viral presence consisting of signification processes and relationship between objects, people, places, ideas, and so forth. So a presence that strives to create friction, and push new ideas. And I was really intrigued by this concept that you introduced in, I think, a text about your exhibition in Munich, Does Permanence Matter, which is this idea of transmission. So as a chain of incessant transformations, right, in which both sender and receiver are modified, but also the message in itself is modified. And I thought that somehow connected to this idea of the curatorial as being a viral presence that sets things in motion through the gathering of objects, spaces, people, discourses, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering how you see this dimension of the curatorial in your practice, in your nomadism in between these neatly defined disciplinary spaces, and how maybe the curatorial can be part of the struggle, or part of the lessening or worsening of that struggle that we were talking about before.
I mean, for us, or I think at least for me, the curatorial is almost the same way a production of processes or of propositions, let's say, as it is doing or developing a piece in itself. Yeah. So we oftentimes just depending on our idea and our process that is following ideas, we just think, okay, we have to include like this person and that person, and suddenly a project that started as what you would call an autonomous work or so starts to open up and switches into a curatorial something. Yeah. So for us, it's even not decisive to make this clear. Are we the curators of something, or are we the artists, or are we the architects? Or so for us, it's more or less how can we find a specific role in processes, and how can we also be self-reflective in these processes? Yeah. Because obviously also for us, the same is true as for everyone else. Hierarchies or roles that are somehow commissioned to us, yeah, imply certain power relations. And the question is how to deal with these relations and how to deal with the fact that at the end of the semester you have to give grades to students, you know, and at the end you are the one who has the last word, even though you are emphasizing throughout the semester. Let's set this up as a collective something. Yeah, let's try to be as flat as possible, you know, let's try to have an equal conversation about these things. At the end, yeah, you are assigned the teacher or the professor, or let's say just to easily move between the different roles, be that a curatorial or an educational role. The power is always something that is given to you, but also taken. Yeah, and the question is, how can you address this? At least, even if we cannot always deconstruct hierarchies or power positions, also. How can we at least make them transparent and reflect on them also? Yeah.
And do you think this liquidity of roles that seems to have been like increasingly normalized, of this fluidity between an artist and a curator and a spatial practitioner, is something that still provides that some sort of alternative or friction, or even that has become part of that power structure and normalized and unable to thus produce any sort of criticality from within?
I think criticality is always ongoing, no matter where you come from, no matter if you are attributed an artist or a curator or whatever. It's the roles that are given to you, or that you borrow or that you steal, yeah, whatever. Yeah, it's really just within the making and within certain processes that you can deal with these power structures. I don't care if a curator is an artist or a curator, you know. For me, the most important question is how is he or she reflecting on these structures on site also, yeah, that he or she is at that moment helping to constitute also, and therefore I don't think that that there is any difference between the artist curator or the curator or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. it has been through the making. Yeah. Sorry, Asli.
Or even the curator architect, because we all know it has a lot to do with the decisions of space and how to negotiate one object with the others and with the neighborhoods. So it's actually also very architectural work, curating, thinking on the neighborhoods so there's also architecture, I think, that it comes on top of it. But also if we think, for example, on the feminist spatial utopias lexicon in space, so it brings, I think that's very obvious, because it starts with a kind of a selection process that includes, we mentioned Francis Gabe, for example, with the self-cleaning house and so on, but also builds on these ideas with some, I would like to use this word and context, with some speculative models or videos and texts and so on. So how would we think about this? Is it an curatorial work or an architectural or an artistic work? Because and we see, let's say, this model, kind of a small sculpture, let's say, but it has also a lot to do with architecture, but it starts with a selection process.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and it's basically a construction. Yeah, every lexicon is a construction, fundamental or like founded on values of those who are constructing it, and we try to make this very clear, because we are inventing many of the entries, yeah, or we are remodeling, or we are just proposing possible entries also. So this lexicon is also a strategy against the lexicon. Yeah. It's also a lexicon, and at the same time the deconstruction of a lexicon. Yeah. And obviously there are funny things there as well. So it's also about not being too serious with everything that enters this thing, yeah, that enters the lexicon or the space of a lexicon. Yeah.
I wanted to go back to something that you said, Mona, about teaching and the academy, and you both teach cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary courses in art and architecture and these fields in their vicinity. And I was wondering, on the one hand, like what set of what has the lexicon, for example, allowed you to bring to these academic settings, or what are the methodologies, feminist methodologies, that you might have applied through your courses or your teaching methodologies? Or and then I was thinking also if you could comment a little bit on what is the possibility that, if we're talking about feministic pedagogic methodologies within an academic context, we also need to consider the increasing privatization of universities and monetization of knowledge. How again can you create certain friction through those structures, but also even implement an alternative to that from within?
Can I answer, because that's a hot topic for me? So the first question is the feminist influence, let's say, on our teaching. Even though in Germany universities are German speaking, yeah, like just to start with, all my courses are English, yeah, because obviously there are definitely also foreign students, that simply don't know German, and they are just lost and left alone. Yeah, that's a structural issue at German universities, in my opinion. But there is also, let's say, another reason to do so, because I'm not a native speaker in English. Nobody is, basically, or very few in this environment. So it immediately levels, because obviously with my experience with architecture and art, and with my experience in teaching, would I speak German, I would immediately be so much faster and so much more fluent than the students. Yeah, but just to start stumbling in English altogether, somehow, at least that's something I really hope that it works. Stumbling in English has to do with a certain kind of leveling, yeah, of linguistic hierarchies. That's like just the setup, and then I mean, I really try to communicate that for me the process is more important than a final result. So all the studios I'm teaching, they are open-ended, basically. So I never have a brief like, okay, let's do a museum or something, or let's do an exhibition, even, is not the case. But let's start from a question or from a desire, yeah, and develop processes. Oftentimes there are similar problems as with our own practice, that at the end you have difficulties to reconstruct this process, to figure out what has happened or so. Yeah, but still, I think it's at least my route of doing things. And then, of course, I'm also working hard in my conversations with students against preconceptions of function, of solutionism, of optimization, of rationalizing things that happened intuitively. All these things that are commonplace at universities, especially at architecture departments, not so much in art departments, but at architecture departments, they still are. Yeah. So that's, and when it comes to and now the really hot topic, when it comes to the economization of the universities, I think I cannot just react to this other than we have to all go on a general strike, you know? It's just like something we have to confront from our powerless places and become powerful because we are many. So that's the only thing that I can answer to this question, because I think it's the ruin of the university. It's the ruin of architecture education, to try to educate students for the business of architecture, for the professional life of architecture. I really don't think that is what the university should do. Yeah? And also I don't think the university is able to do it. It always fails while trying to do so. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Sorry,
I like the idea of general strike, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking about that idea of general strike. Maybe it's also connected to this idea of subtraction, right? Of you subtracting n-1 that you're very fond of. So And I was also thinking, like when you say this formation of architects for future, for the architecture machine in the future, or this more, mainstream practice of architecture. And I was also wondering on the legacy that already exists, built, like our built environment is based on patriarchal and capitalists and so on and so forth, processes that are really materialized in our surroundings. So going back maybe also to this idea of the lexicon and this recollection of stories that have been omitted in the canon of architecture, many of them. And not only you're paying this homage and rescuing these stories, but you're also turning them into contemporary propositions for other ways of thinking spaces. And I think that's that balance between, recollection, documentation, and collection and proposition is really beautiful. And I was thinking, what is the force that it brings to the subtraction, if that's even possible, of the already existing built environment that does not follow any of those fundaments or any of those values that you're unearthing or putting again on the table with this lexicon. So would the strategy of subtraction be a process to kind of reorganize, respatialize, or deal with the built environment that we have inherited from centuries of of these hierarchies?
Perhaps to just frame this notion of subtraction that we were really excited about when we somehow followed it through different disciplines, and just imagined how a play of Romeo and Juliet could be without Romeo, even so that's the first thing. So we are also easily excited about things, that just to be very honest about this. At the same time, it's not so much, the subtraction is not so much, let's say, something that we would propose as a general strategy to deal with our built environment. I think that is something that is has to be decided on for every particular site, for every particular project, for every particular objective, let's say. But when we look into the history of architecture, and when we look at how, and that's perhaps the most educational notion at that moment, when we look at how architecture is communicated at university, it's always about adding to something, or erasing everything and adding a new completeness or so. So it's more about an underlying myth, or an underlying almost a naturalized logic within architecture. And that's basically why we thought of it as a very powerful proposition, just to reflect on how self-understandingly architects always add. And of course it's very much changing at the moment. If you just look at Lacaton Vassal, the winners of the Pritzker Prize, so that's really like a huge, I think it's a huge signal, that that things are really changing, even within the slow discipline of architecture.
In these terms, with the subtraction and architecture, we were also very much obsessed with the project called Kitchenless House by Alice Constant Austin, because we were especially very much looking into its observing how powerful it is in terms of the construction of the family, to turn back to the feminist approach, because so designing houses, community houses without kitchens and with a big patio outside, somehow looking into this project, we were already imagining the whole community not only eating as a core family together, not in the kitchen, but outside with all the neighbors, and so this somehow constructs a new social structure and a way of living. Of course, this kitchenless house didn't want us to suffer and stay hungry day and night. There was a concept of course, it was about paid labor, not unpaid woman kitchen work, so to say. There was a kind of a community. There was a building planned for in that both men and women should cook and get paid for this. And the utopian part was that was a tunnel between this cooking place and the houses, so that you don't see the dirty dishes, and probably that the food is still hot. But so I think, of course, subtracting a complete building, but what happens if we start to subtract very crucial parts of the living spaces? Because at the school, when we study architecture, we do so many projects of family houses. I think I did 4 or 5 of these single family house projects, designs, all with like a fixed program of like even where the children room, children 1, children 2, and kitchen and bathroom and so on.
What interested me, especially with the kitchenless house, was not necessarily like eliminating the kitchen, like this kind of functional space from the organism of a building, but how it left the building almost as separated in 2 halves. It's almost like there was this crack and the whole thing was falling apart. Yeah, through this open space that Asli was addressing. So it somehow again also showed a friction that is on a metaphorical level part of architecture and our lives, but also in this case a very physical friction in the middle of the house. It's just separated, and you have to cross the open patio to get from one from one room to the other room also, and this was something I found extremely interesting when it comes to how to challenge spaces that we take for granted, or that we somehow are used to a certain arrangement or so. Yeah. And so for me it was not necessarily about getting rid of the kitchen, and also because it addressed in a first wave feminism obviously unpaid housework, and it should centralize and professionalize this work, but for me it was really this kind of spatial operation that somehow showed the building completely out of balance, and yeah. So.
And also kitchenless house was actually also curtainless house. And at one place she's describing the most she hates curtains in a house, Alice Constance Austin.
That's very modernist.
Yeah, indeed. Wow. Well, there are many other questions related to that, but I'm aware of the time. and of our Zoom fatigues and our screen fatigue at the end of the day. But I did want to maybe finish with something that I mentioned in the introduction, and we didn't cover yet, but I'm super interested in it, which is junk chat. And maybe talk a little bit more about the role, this editorial practice, or even the writing as a tool for you. But yeah, through junk chat, I'm curious to hear more about it.
Junk chat is perhaps our oldest project, but it's still very alive. Now it is dealing with NFTs. NFTs, perhaps better pronounced, so with the crypto art scene, as it was very much, and it's therefore called a magazine for art, architecture, and media, because it always was very interested in this liquid spaces where we cannot even see the separation between an analog space and a digital one, and how there are perhaps certain moments of failure or of disruption, but actually it's something that is very much and very much more continuous as we are perhaps experiencing it right now, because we cannot physically meet, and it seems so desperate to talk to screens and to meet through screens, and it's so tiring also. But junk chat was always and is still occupied with a very subversive view on what should become part of a physical magazine or not. Yeah, because at one point we published the magazine on we called it Net Heart issue, and it was all about bringing something into a paper format that is actually digital, and and it's again perhaps also going back to the question of transmission, which always means a transformation, transformation of all of the participants in this process, the sender, the receiver, but obviously also what we might call the message also. Yeah. So junk chat is super wild. You cannot even explain it, you know.
Yes, but it was our first collaborative project. So it was our first collaboration. Our collaboration has started with junk chat, and maybe I can add that junk chat, in a way, we see it as a platform, not only as a fanzine or magazine. It's changes somehow. It's translating into different formats, because at one point in Stuttgart, as we were living there in South Germany, it became a temporary space where we did some events, and then it became a magazine again. And now, as Mona mentioned, it's started minting NFTs for haters. Some critical artists, actually, junk chat contributors, are minting through junk chat, maybe we can say.
It's having a life of its own. So we never really sit down and negotiate like the next steps or so. At one point, like a friend of ours asks whether we have the possibility of posting or of minting, as they call it, his animated GIF, and suddenly junk chat is there, and it says, of course, just send it over and we do the rest also. Yeah, and that's like this very it's a very self-organizing process. Yeah. So that's also why there has been no printed edition for a while now. Yeah. But there are things happening, and we even don't know about them, you know. So that's structured.
It has a life of its own, indeed. But that's beautiful. Congratulations. Thank you so much. I think it's time for everyone to have a break from the screens for today. But it was an absolute pleasure, and so many other questions that hopefully we can discuss in person soon.
Yes, let's hope so. It was super nice to meet you, Bruno. Also, Joanna, thank you for hosting us here, and to all the audiences that we didn't even see and had no contact to. Thank you for joining. But see you soon, Bruno.
Yes, thank you so much. And for the audience that we didn't see, next Thursday, there's a conversation with Meta Situ. And yes, thank you again, Joanna, Paulo, Instituto. Enough for today.